Ivan Milat was Australia's worst serial killer. From 1989 to 1992, he abducted, robbed, sexually molested, tortured and murdered 7 backpackers. He hid their bodies in the Belangolo forest south of Sydney. Did the harsh environment Milat grew up in put him on the inevitable path to murder? Or was he born to kill? Australia is famous for its wide open spaces, beaches and sunshine. Every year, over 5 million visitors from all over the world come to explore this vast land. Most travellers stay in the popular backpackers scene in King's Cross in the heart of Sydney. Hitchhikers take to the roads, not really understanding just how vulnerable they are. Australia had the reputation of being one of the safest countries in the world. In the early 90s, Ivan Milat was to change that forever.
The way he killed them was shocking. Some people were tortured, some people were sexually assaulted. He used some people for target practice. He was a man who enjoyed killing. He was a man who enjoyed the power and the sexual gratification that he got from his victims.
Young victims were abducted, their spines had been cut, and then he played with them like, you know, a cat would play with a mouse. They were particularly heinous.
I think it was violence for the sake of violence and someone who enjoyed an explosion of violence.
He specifically targeted backpackers because they were distant from relatives and friends. There was less likelihood of people knowing where they were, what they were doing.
There were 7 young people in the prime of their lives who must have undergone the most terrible ordeal, and it barely deserves thinking about, and one can only wonder how their close family members can cope with such a thought.
I just can't begin to describe him as a human being. I don't think that he has the feelings of a human being.
On the 30th of December 1989, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, 2 Australians visiting Sydney, were last seen alive leaving Surrey Hills to hitchhike 300 miles to Albury. In January 1991, German backpacker Simone Schmiedl left Sydney to hitchhike to meet her mother in Melbourne. On the 20th of December 1991, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, 2 German hitchhikers, left King's Cross to hitchhike to Darwin. 18th of April 1992, British backpackers Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark were last seen alive leaving King's Cross to hitchhike around Australia. None of these young people were ever seen or heard from again. They were all young and carefree, searching for fun and adventure. They were all last seen hitchhiking along the Hume Highway. They all accepted a ride from a friendly stranger, and they were all killed by Ivan Milat. Paul Kidd is Australia's top expert on serial killers. He's dedicated his life to researching and writing books on Australia's own unique brand of killers.
He was a serial killer who was extremely clever within the Australian genre, and by that I mean it's in the bush, it's a lonely place, he's abducting strangers, people he doesn't know. He's taking them to a place of absolute isolation where he's committing his crimes. He's secreting the bodies, hiding the bodies in a place that is very, very unlikely to be caught. 90% of, or even more probably, of Australia's serial killers are pure opportunists.
Whilst they often differ in their modus operandi, Australia's serial killers have some things in common.
They come from an underprivileged background. There's a very strong chance that they would have been molested as a child, usually have a very, very poor working background.
Ivan Milat certainly fits this profile. He was born on the 27th of December 1944 into a poor working-class family in rural Australia. His parents would often argue. Milat was the fifth of 14 children, so what little parental love and attention there was spread thinly. Ivan's younger brother, George, remembers just how hard life was in the Milat family.
I didn't get on with him because he was quite wild with me all the time, maybe just because I stayed out of trouble.
The weaker Milat children were often bullied, so Ivan learned at an early age to be dominant. George was often a victim of Ivan's violent nature. He recalls one incident when he innocently brought it to his brother's attention that his car tyre was going down.
And I said, "You got a cooked valve in your car. Why? You got a slow leak." Ivan walked out and come back and started yelling at me about it. And Billy says, "Hey, he told you your tyre's going flat and you're flying off at him over it. Why?" Mum said, "What are you going to cook at him for? It was good enough to come and tell you he's got a tyre going flat and you come in and started yelling at him." And I said, "I'm not telling you nothing no more."
Author Mark Whittaker spent 4 years researching his book on Ivan Milat. He spoke to friends and family to gain a unique insight.
Ivan's father, Stephen, was a very strict disciplinarian, and he was a product of different times. Neighbours reported seeing him once standing on the back of 2 of his sons, beating them with a piece of 4x2.
One significant factor in Ivan's early life was the death of his sister, Margaret.
I watched my younger sister die over a car accident. And I said, "Why?" I think the reason why we got thought so well is because we were in a big family. And I think that's the only reason we coped so well.
Ivan raced to the scene. It was just around the corner from their home, and apparently held her in his arms, blood everywhere. She died 2 weeks later, never having regained consciousness.
Teenage Ivan had an early introduction to death. Traumatised, he became obsessed with his appearance.
Self-image was obviously very important to Ivan. It's part of that whole control thing. He had to control everything. He wouldn't touch alcohol because he'd lose control. He was always very neatly dressed. His garden and his house always had to be immaculate. Everything had to be under his control.
Another person who remembers the young Ivan growing up was his old boss, Peter Cantarella. Peter owned the local fruit shop where Ivan worked as a teenager.
And he worked for about 12 months straight, and he was a really good worker.
Ivan asked Peter to go guarantor for a loan to buy a car. Peter agreed because he was such a good kid. Ivan got the car and Peter hardly ever saw him again. He wouldn't turn up to work, wouldn't pay off the loan. Peter ended up having to pay off the loan because he'd gone guarantor.
Peter was furious and things soon turned nasty.
Subsequently, a group of the Milat kids started harassing Peter and his family and throwing stones at their roof, and it was getting out of control.
My wife and I were working in the shop, and they took all the guns and took all the jewellery off my first wife.
Peter took matters into his own hands. There was certainly a fight, and Bill and Ivan came off second best.
And I thumped him, and then, I bust his Ivan there. He was a good worker too. As soon as he started to get in the wrong crowd, and he just turned bad.
This was the beginning of a life of crime for Ivan Milat.
And Ivan had a share of trouble when he was younger, until he'd end up in jail. It was the only way it stopped.
The Milat boys were often in trouble. George remembers journeys to the local jail to visit his brothers.
Long Bay Jail was very popular. There was Ivan. I went to see Michael. I never seen Billy or Boris or Wally. Ivan, he did a lot of time too until the big one come up.
Ivan began his criminal career in a very petty manner. A lot of it was car-related, stealing cars. He broke into an army barracks once and stole a safe with a mate. He wasn't a particularly good criminal. He kept getting caught, and indeed spent most of the 60s in institutions. In terms of a breeding ground for for evil, you can't do better than taking your brightest young criminals, throwing them all into an institution and then totally dehumanising them.
Ivan moved on from petty crimes to the more serious crime of rape when he picked up 2 female hitchhikers.
On their way to Melbourne when Ivan picked them up, they managed to confuse and confound him for some time before striking a deal. Ivan agreed to not kill them if one of them had sex with him.
He was later caught and charged, but he was acquitted when the girls changed their testimony.
They're the last known victims of Ivan in that sort of sense that survived. I mean, he knew that leaving survivors wasn't a good way to continue on his merry way.
Ivan met his wife Karen in 1975. He was 30, she was 17. Karen was 6 weeks pregnant with another man's child. Needing someone who could provide for her, she stayed with him, but would soon regret that decision.
It appears to have been not a particularly happy relationship. Ivan was incredibly domineering and jealous. Wouldn't allow Karen out of the house if he didn't know where she was. She had to account for every cent she ever spent, had to produce receipts.
He was violent and unpredictable. He would control his anger for a long period of time and would then explode at any given moment.
He wasn't afraid to beat her or at least intimidate her, and by the end of their relationship, yeah, she was a nervous wreck. When she left him in 1987, he bided his time, but he got revenge eventually by burning down the front of her parents' house.
He was upset about his divorce, but from what I know of, he caused it. He started punching into her at home. Mum called the police on him over it. Ivan did get violent, very violent.
When Karen subsequently left him, you know, he'd lost that control over her. You know, it's one of the theories that he then went to seek that control elsewhere, out on the highway.
On the 13th of July 1989, Karen and Ivan Milat divorced. 6 months later, the first 2 backpackers went missing. For a period of 2.5 years, between January 1990 and April 1992, Milat became a ruthless, cold-blooded and sadistic killer who scoured the highways looking for victims. Ivan Milat's colourful criminal history got worse after the breakdown of his marriage. The power and control he once exerted over his wife was gone. He turned to the highway to fulfill his fantasies of dominance and control. After being acquitted of the rape and abduction of 2 female hitchhikers in 1971, Milat realized that future victims would not be allowed to escape. Milat regarded himself as above the law. His large collection of guns was part of his outlaw image. Guns were commonplace in the Milat family.
I had an air rifle as a kid. And I still got one today. I had a bow and arrow then, a slingshot, and an air rifle. Only now I've got bigger guns. But then we toured the country and went shooting. And we managed to stay out of trouble when we did. Well, some of us did.
Milat family shooting expeditions often took place at one of the Milat properties, where they even constructed their own shooting range.
You never ever leave a gun loaded no matter what.
Ivan's younger brother George proudly talks us through his extensive gun collection, which includes Ivan's very own musket.
This is called a number 2 air rifle. That is a 410. This is what you call a 12-gauge shotgun. This is called a Remington 2506. And this is the big fella's gun. And when you pull the trigger, this here closes.
Ivan loved his guns so much that he even took them to his job as a road worker. His boss for many years was Don Borthwick.
You joined in a bit of a joke and that, but when you was away, you was sort of more of a loner than anything. You know, the boys would go down to the pub. I mean, you got your drinkers and you got your players, you know. Ivan was neither. He'd drink his Coke and he'd sit there and read his books and go back to his room, you know. We had blokes on the clock all night playing pool and other blokes chasing women. Ivan, for the years that I was with him and the few times I went away, wasn't in there any days. Have his gun books and back to bed. Boys would have their girly magazines. Ivan would have his gun magazines. The knife was always in his bag of us, but, you know, he'd get it out and cut an apple in half, yeah, and that was it.
He remembers one incident where Ivan was showing off his guns.
He had big guns in the end. When he worked around the corner at another company, two blokes had to go at him one night, so the next night he walked in for lunch, pulled the gun out, put it on the table. He said, "Who we talked to tonight?" And they both walked out. Yeah, he always had that in his bag, and a big knife, like a Bowie knife or something like that. He always had a knife in his bag. Cutting up apples, mate. He could have cut horses up with it. It was a big knife.
No one quite knows how Ivan progressed from this fantasy world into the very real world of killing. Ivan picked up British backpacker Paul Onions hitchhiking on the Hume Highway on the outskirts of Sydney. Onions was heading to Mildura to work as a fruit picker. The prosecutor on the case, Mark Tedeschi, remembers the story of the man who would later become his star witness.
Ivan had approached him in a shop on the side of the Hume Highway. He was pleased to be getting this lift. He sat in the front of this four-wheel drive vehicle that Ivan owned, and they were driving along the Hume Highway, and they came to a particular point. All of a sudden, he noticed that the atmosphere in the vehicle changed. Ivan stopped the car, got out of the driver's side and was rummaging around underneath his seat, and all of a sudden produced a pistol.
Onions was terrified and made a split-second decision.
And he decided that no matter what, he was not going to stay in that car. He just jumped out of that car and ran up the Hume Highway, zigzagging backwards and forwards as he'd been told to do in the Navy. If you're being fired at by the enemy and you're running away, then you don't just run in a straight line, you zigzag. And he was zigzagging as he was running, and he heard two shots ring out.
In broad daylight on a busy highway, Ivan ruthlessly opened fire. A car finally stopped and Paul Onions jumped in. The driver had inadvertently saved him, not only from hours of torture, but also from certain death. He was taken to the local Bowral police station where he gave a statement. It was filed amongst the other petty crimes, and it wouldn't be for another 4 years that police would realise just how vital that statement would be. Following Onions' escape, there were no murders for a year. Whilst one British backpacker was lucky to get away, 2 more wouldn't be so fortunate. Caroline Clark was the 21-year-old daughter of Ian and Jackie Clark. A bright and bubbly girl, she loved life and always dreamed of travelling to Australia.
Before she was even a teenager, Australia was always the goal, sort of age 10 upwards, whether it was a diet of neighbours and home and away, I don't know.
Off she went and she was having a wonderful time.
She met Welsh-born nanny Joanne Walters in King's Cross, and they decided to go fruit picking together. To save on cash, they hitchhiked against Caroline's parents' advice.
You know, we'd always talked about hitchhiking as something that should not be encouraged, and we'd always said to Caroline, look, whatever you do, you must never do this on your own. We'd much rather she went on public transport. You know, if it meant working for a bit longer to get the money to pay for the fare. But, well, she didn't.
For once, there wasn't safety in numbers. On Easter Saturday, the 18th of April, 1992, both girls were seen heading towards King's Cross Station, carrying sleeping bags and a tent. They were never seen alive again. 6 weeks later, and with no contact from Caroline, the Clarks began to get worried.
She always rang on family birthdays just to say hello and, you know, happy birthday. So when Emma didn't get a call, we thought, that's a little strange.
That's when the alarm bells really started ringing, and we started putting into place you know, a serious search.
The Clarks did everything possible in their search for their youngest daughter.
We got flybills made up with the girls' photographs and so on, and sent them out to all the major backpacking hostels, big bundles of them, and said, when anybody's moving from here, will you ask them to take a bundle and move on to the next place and get them to put them. And so they spread across Australia remarkably quickly.
You can't believe anything's gone wrong, you know, you don't want to think anything's gone wrong, but of course as the weeks turned into months.
I don't think we ever really, until quite late on, faced up to the fact that they weren't coming back.
You are sort of in a state of limbo, I must say. Not a nice time.
4 months later, Caroline would be found.
You know, a different kind of anguish comes in. You know they're dead, and so you can start to mourn them.
2 cross-country runners discovered the girls' remains in the Belangolo forest, just near where Paul Onions had his narrow escape 2 years earlier. Ian and Jackie Clark knew their daughter had been brutally murdered, but now their question was by whom?
We knew the broad outline of what had happened to her, and I think that was horrid, because it was such an evil and disgusting event, really, that you start reliving it on their behalf, and you conjure up what they'd gone through.
After the discovery of the girls' bodies in the forest, the police set up Task Force Air to find the killer. The task force was headed by one of Australia's most experienced major crime detectives, Commander Clive Small.
They had multiple bullet wounds and multiple stab wounds, as did most of the victims. It shows a pattern of behaviour that goes clearly beyond just the killing of a person, and that the satisfaction continues well after the actual death of the person.
2 brutal murders, but no hard evidence and no witnesses. They called in leading Australian forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Rod Milton. Milton has over 20 years' experience in profiling serial killers. He was driven back to the scene of the crime to get a feel for the horrific events that had occurred there. He sat undisturbed, thinking over all the information he'd been told about the murders. He takes us on a tour of the crime scenes.
This was where the body of Miss Walters was found, and she was lying under the rock. The injuries were very severe and multiple stab wounds. There was one stab wound to the neck that would have been immediately fatal. I think it was violence for the sake of violence, and someone who enjoyed an explosion of violence. Disarrangement of the clothing suggests that there was a sexual element to it. That's as far as one can go. But there did seem to be that combination of the 2 factors. Whatever was done was probably of a humiliating nature, because that was what Ivan most likely did with his victims. It was to get power more than anything else, and that Ivan Milat was a person who was intent on getting power over his victims rather than anything else.
Caroline Clark's body was found just 50 metres away. It too was left in a special position that meant something to the killer.
She was lying face down with one arm up and her head on her hand, and she'd been repeatedly shot through the head. The autopsy results showed different entry points to the skull. It suggests that the killer had moved the head in order to do what pleased him. It had the impression of being a very deliberate, cold and calculated murder. Well, it's not unknown for people who commit serial offences like this to arrange the bodies in a particular way, and there was some similarity between Miss Walters and Miss Clark in that both were lying face down, and I think they had their arms raised up with their hands somewhere in the vicinity of their head. Now, evidently that had some sort of significance for the murderer.
Dr. Milton started to build a profile that would prove vital in the eventual capture of the killer. He believes that the way the victims were killed meant that two people had to be responsible.
I said, well, here are two people who are used to living with violence, who probably have a criminal record, who don't mind what they do to others, who get pleasure from it, and the fact that one body was at some distance from the other suggested that if there were two offenders, that maybe the second one had a reason to feel a bit shy of what the other would feel about him. In regard to dominance, the sadistic and calculated person is more likely to dominate the impulsive and a more openly aggressive person. And that gave me the hypothesis that there were two killers, one of whom was perhaps a bit older and more dominant, sadistic and cold, very, very violent but very restrained, and the other one of a more spontaneous, impulsive nature.
The profile indicated that the killer was someone who loved guns but hated women, someone who loved power but hated authority. Clive Small conducted an extensive search of past criminal records for people who might fit that profile, and who also lived close to the Belangolo forest.
Rod was very close on a number of points. He'd said that the person would probably be a blue-collar worker, would probably be a hard worker, would be a loner. We were dealing with a person who knew the forest area very well. We were dealing with a person who probably knew the Liverpool area very well, because that's where the victims were being picked up. And that led us to believe that the person lived in the area. We also had good reason to believe that the person was very familiar with firearms and was probably somewhat of a fanatic. We had the Milat family nominated to us as a family we should look at.
Despite the suspicions surrounding the Milats, there was no evidence and no witnesses. The police therefore couldn't get a warrant to search any of the Milat homes. The only course of action they could take was to keep Ivan Milat under surveillance.
We looked at all members of the Milat family. What we found was that Ivan was the only person who had an opportunity on every occasion. The other brothers all had alibis on at least a number of occasions.
A year later, a bushwalker found the skeletal remains of two more bodies. They were later identified as missing Australians Deborah Everest and James Gibson. As with Clark and Walters, they had both been killed by multiple stab wounds and their bodies covered up with debris. A serial killer was at large.
The pattern at each scene was quite similar. What we found was that their personal clothing or luggage, their backpacks and that, were taken. We found that in most cases, both a knife and firearms had been used to commit the murders. A number of people had been both stabbed and shot. You have found indications that the victims had been tied up in some fashion, and that was a common pattern.
Police suspected there were more bodies to be found. One of the biggest searches in Australia's history had begun.
We wanted to make sure that when we did the forest this time, there was nothing left unchecked. The search was limited by natural barriers and boundaries. For example, some fire trails led to a gorge, which are several hundred feet down, so that we couldn't go any further than that. Others took us to roadways and other natural barriers so that we could say, with some degree of comfort, that the whole of the forest, for practical purposes, had been searched.
Over 300 police officers searched 78 kilometres of fire track in the Belangolo State Forest, often on their hands and knees, as they pushed their way through the dense terrain. Within a month, the remains of a further 3 victims had been found, bringing the total to 7. Simone Schmiedel, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied were finally found dead. Some victims were bludgeoned, some were strangled, others were shot and stabbed. Many were sexually assaulted, one was decapitated. The more Milat killed, the more ferocious the assaults became.
What we found was that the crime scenes tended to get a bit larger, that there appeared to have been more activity at each scene, that the murders themselves became more sophisticated and more ritualistic, and more time was being spent at the scene by the murderer.
In November 1993, the police appealed to the public for help in tracking down this brutal killer. They received 5,119 calls. One of the calls was from British backpacker Paul Onions, the man who had been robbed but managed to get away with his life. He saw in the newspaper that the remains of Clark and Walters had been found in the Belangolo State Forest, the same place he'd been attacked years earlier. He was flown to Australia and positively identified his attacker, Ivan Milat.
With that identification, we found a lot of other corroborative evidence that we could use. For example, we had found that Ivan was available, if you like, was not at work on any of the dates when the murders or abductions took place. We had conducted very extensive inquiries into the weapons that were being purchased and the bullets that had been used.
The police now had sufficient evidence to arrest Ivan Milat for the attempted murder of Paul Onions and were able to get the search warrant they so desperately needed. They planned to search not only Ivan Milat's house but also the houses of his family. This was the only way to find out if he worked alone or if someone else had joined him on his sadistic rampage. Ivan Milat gained immense pleasure from the stalking, entrapment and killing of his victims. His prey, young backpackers alone on a deserted highway. After months of close surveillance, the police finally got a search warrant and raided Milat's home on the 22nd of May 1994. Sydney journalist Neil Mercer closely followed the case.
When the police raided Ivan's house, they found a treasure trove of evidence. There were backpacks, there were tents, there were cooking sets that had belonged to some of the backpackers, there were cameras, there were all sorts of things that they could trace back to individual backpackers.
Police also raided the houses of other members of the Milat family. Here they found a huge amount of ammunition, an arsenal of weapons, and rope and cable ties that were identical to those found at the murder scenes.
Items were found in almost every house that related to the murder, one way or another. And also, in every occasion, the people who had possession of that property pointed the finger at Ivan as being the source of it.
Milat, like so many other sexually sadistic serial killers, was a compulsive trophy taker, retaining clothing and other personal items so that he could use them later to relive his actions. These trophies would form a major part of the evidence that would later convict Milat.
These killers become very adept at concealing their weapons, but by the same token they want to keep them, so they're attached to them, and even though they're the thing that might lead to their conviction, they're not going to give them up.
Milat was finally in police custody, yet he maintained his innocence.
He, I believe, thought that he was still in charge and in control, and I don't think that at that stage he believed he was going to get charged. He's never admitted to anything.
Well, it's often said that the reason that offenders like this don't confess is because they want to keep their fantasies and the events to themselves so that they can enjoy their imagination.
Ivan Milat did not conform to the usual serial killer profiles. Most serial killers do not murder both sexes, and very rarely do they kill more than one victim at a time. Milat has never spoken publicly about his crimes, so experts can only theorize about what turned him into such a brutal and remorseless killer. According to forensic psychiatrist Rod Milton, Milat must have been motivated by power.
Well, he did it, number one, because it was enjoyable for him to do that, and he perceived it as satisfying some emotional need that wasn't being satisfied in any other way. And he also did it because he lacked the internal prohibitions that would have prevented other people from causing such suffering.
A life of petty crime had transcended into rape and eventually murder, suggesting that maybe he was intrinsically evil. But it could equally be argued that events in his life had provided the catalyst for his murderous actions.
There was no suggestion that there was a particular part of his brain, if you like, driving him to commit these crimes. This was about Ivan being in control. I think his satisfaction was about, I've gained their confidence, now I've gained control of them, and I'm now going to exert that control. And that was a progressive thing through from the abduction through to the actual murders. The amount of wounds from knives and bullets that were inflicted on the victims shows that it was not just a matter of killing them, that there was a satisfaction to be derived from the continual inflicting of harm and injury on the victims.
I would say he was more than twisted. He was definitely gone. Everybody in the family, a few of my brothers said, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. There was definitely something wrong with him.
And one of the interesting things about Ivan Milat is if you look at the period of the serial killings, it's a period, it starts just after he breaks up with his wife, and then another relationship with a second woman also fails. He then kills the first two young backpackers, and the killing only stops some years later when he enters into a relationship.
Australia's biggest ever murder trial began in March 1996. Ivan Milat pleaded not guilty to all charges. The parents of all the victims were in attendance.
I was looking at this man every day, and I couldn't bring myself to believe that such an insignificant little man could have wrought such horror and misery on so many people.
Milat's defence lawyer was Terry Martin. He was faced with a difficult task. His client was denying any involvement in the crimes he had been charged with.
His instructions were that he did not do it. And as I say, it goes from there though, if he didn't do it, then someone terribly close to him must have. We were permitted to conduct ourselves in the way that we did do, which was the proper way to do it, and see whether or not anyone in the family or associated with the family may have been in the frame rather than Ivan Milat, and thereby create the doubt that it was Ivan Milat.
But we found no evidence of a second person. He was the one who gave the property to friends and relatives to wear. He was the one who had control of the type of bullets that we knew we used, and his house itself, is fair to say, it was like an Aladdin's gold mine when you searched it for the amount of property that was around him. And I think that reflects very much on his attitude of, I'm in control, I'm in charge, and he gets his satisfaction in a variety of ways. But also, I think he was such a control freak that there's no way he would have wanted to share what he saw as his glory and satisfaction with another person.
There were various pieces of vital evidence directly related to Caroline Clark, Milat's last victim. The prosecutor in the case was Mark Tedeschi.
There was some rope that was found at Ivan's home, in a bag, in a pillowcase actually. There was some blood on this rope. And this blood was analysed, and this English forensic scientist was able to say that the blood from the rope was the kind of blood that you would expect from a child of these two parents.
It was nice that we were able, Jackie and myself, were able to do something which assisted in, confirming his guilt.
Police also found parts of one of the murder weapons hidden in the wall cavity in Ivan Milat's home.
They could conclusively show by ballistics evidence that it was one of the two weapons that had been used at two of the death scenes. Ivan's response to that was, I know nothing about this weapon. Even though It was painted with camouflage paint, and there were a whole lot of other weapons of guns that he acknowledged were his, painted with exactly the same kind of camouflage paint.
One item Milat didn't hide was a framed photograph of his girlfriend wearing a distinctive Benetton top. A top that had been owned by Caroline Clark. Her mother Jackie remembers it well.
She bought it when we were still living down south, and it was one of her favourite garments. She was always wearing it, and obviously went with her to Australia.
His removing parts of clothing and I think a rucksack and perhaps other possessions is characteristic of this kind of offender, and to give it to a girlfriend is also characteristic. The hunter who goes out and kills some creature in the bush and then has the head stuffed and puts it over the mantelpiece, and every time he sees it he thinks, what a great man I am to have killed this wild beast.
Ivan was so confident that he would be cleared of all charges that he actually chose to take the stand.
I can't say that that was the wrong choice, because if he did not, there's overwhelming evidence there against him calling for an explanation. The jury would want to hear an explanation saying, why have you got all of that property at your house? Tell us about it. I think he presented himself in a poorer light, unfortunately. Well, it certainly didn't help him.
There was one moment where he was being asked about rubber gloves that had been found at his house. And it was towards the end of the day. It had been a very long cross-examination. And just before 4 o'clock, just before the court's about to rise, Tedeschi asked him a question about the gloves and the forest, and Milat blurted out, "I never wore no..." And he stopped.
And you could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. It was a magical moment. And Tedeschi sort of went on and said, "Do you mean you didn't wear them in the forest?" And then turned to the judge and said, and to the jury, and said, "I think that would be a good moment to adjourn for the day." And so this was left hanging with the jurors overnight. That was the moment that if anybody had doubted the man's guilt, there was something about that moment that said, yes, you did it.
That, coupled with the physical evidence they had, the ballistics, the blood, the DNA, it made for a pretty compelling case.
Ivan Milat was found guilty and was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison for the 7 counts of murder, and to an additional 6 years for the attempted abduction of Paul Onions. To this date, Milat still hasn't admitted his guilt.
The jail he's in Goulburn, it's a special jail, and it's a prison built inside a prison. What's he going to do in there? I don't know. I don't really care. It's his fault for landing in there.
According to his younger brother George, Ivan only ever confided in his mother.
Mum didn't want to believe this one, but she had doubts, and so did all of us. He's been in trouble all his life.
Before her death in 2001, she went to visit Ivan in prison to seek the truth.
And then next time she went there, I asked, "Did he tell you," looking across the table, "did he tell you anything that you did not want to hear?" We looked at each other, and he said, he admitted it. He's not going to admit it publicly. Now she's gone, but she knew the truth before she went.
There's occasional outbreaks of Ivan Milat is innocent, but I just think that's rubbish. I think if you look at all the evidence, if you read the transcript, if you look at the exhibits, where they were found, and Milat's answers in court, there is no doubt that he's the man who killed those 7 people.
Police have good reason to believe that Ivan Milat is responsible for more than just these murders.
But I believe it's in the stage of 28 to 29.
I think the general view is that there are probably about 3 or 4 other murders that we know about that Ivan did, but for which there is simply not enough evidence to charge him.
A plaque now stands as a memorial to the 7 young people that lost their lives in this forest. It remains a symbol of their young spirit.
We went out to the site and saw where the girls were found. And it was something that we had to do. Sorry. No, I'm just happy that he was caught, convicted, and is put away, and is going to stay there for the rest of his natural life.
The knowledge that the killer will never be released is scant consolation for the victims' families. No consolation for a young life lost.
I miss her. And still find family celebrations difficult because there's always somebody missing, you know, you're not complete.
Would she have married? Would she have had children? Sad.